Tēnei te mihi kia koutou e rangatira mā, e hoa mā. Nau mai, hiki mai, kake mai. I acknowledge you as leaders, as elders, and I greet you as friends. We are in, as Minister Barry said, the first city of the Pacific, so I greet you in the languages of the first city of the Pacific. Malu lalele, talofa lava, namaste, kia ora orana, bula vinaka, ni hao. I've already introduced myself, but for those of you who come in late, I'm Cam McCracken. I'm Director of the Dunedin Public Art Gallery. Today's theme is about enabling structures, policies and operations, and it's my privilege to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Boon Hui Tan, who is going to speak about the tension between an increasing expectation that cultural institutions have a global perspective within their programming remit, coupled with the need to be anchored within their local communities. Thinking about this global perspective, it's a truism that the world is getting even more interconnected and smaller, and I was reminded of this a couple of weeks ago when I received an email from Philippa and also Alex. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I thought it was on silent, and I reached in, and I saw the email was from Philippa, and it was talking about this keynote. And I opened. I was very interested in Boon Hui and what he'd been doing, and I flicked through his CV, and it stopped on his directorship of the Singapore Art Museum a few years ago. It's a pertinent reminder of how small the world is, because at the time I was standing in the Singapore Art Museum. It's also a nice segue into Boon Hui's CV. Boon Hui is currently the Vice President, Global Arts and Cultural Programs and Director of the Asia Society Museum in New York. And most previously, he has been the Assistant Chief Executive, Museums and Programs, working at the National Heritage Board in Singapore, where he was responsible for exhibitions, programs and outreach strategies. As I said before that, he was the director of the gorgeous Singapore Art Museum. Boon Hui, if I could welcome you to the stage and invite you to address us. Is your global my global? Creating spaces for the local specificity in the age of global museums.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Kia ora. Thank you to everyone for inviting me here halfway across the world. When I was first asked by the organizers to speak on globalization in the Global Museum, my first reaction was, oh my goodness, it's too large a topic, and there's a lot of cliches surrounding it, and I didn't want to go into a theoretical discussion. So what I thought I would do in the short time I have today, since all of you are professionals working in the arts, is to present a few sort of ideas and initiatives that I've learned in the course of my various incarnations in the arts and heritage sector. And I'm going to focus on my time in Singapore rather than what I'm currently doing in New York, with complete irony, because, or lack of irony, because of course New York has always been accepted as a global center to which all of us working in the arts always aspire to. So it's a little bit strange that I'm telling people about that. So the focus will be on my many years of working in Singapore, which literally, despite its other sort of advantages in as far as the arts and culture is concerned, literally it is a peripheral location, far away from the mainstream developments of what we call global art. And I've always been fascinated, everywhere I've gone, I've always been told, can you make this art center global? Can you make this museum global? And I was very caught and confused by that for a very long time. What did that actually mean? And of course, if you just Google the word global museum, you see it's really all over the place. It literally is hip to be global, that all museums should look to the world, but there's actually very little information on how does one do it if you're a museum director, if you're a curator, if you're planning the programs. What are the lessons that have been learned, particularly outside the Euro-American world, particularly with smaller museums and art centers that have relatively little resources? And a lot of the times when we look at global museums, global programming, what it means is usually masterpiece and blockbuster exhibitions. And usually that means you're global. But that kind of programming, has a little sort of issues with that, two issues basically. The first issue is if you are out in the periphery, usually you are what we call in theatre and performing arts productions, end of life cycle staging posts. Okay, so you don't get the Andrew Lloyd Webber from London, you get the production from you know where. So that's one. The two is, that kind of incoming blockbuster exhibition. It's great press, the sponsors love it. I'm not sure actually how much financial sense it makes in the long term, but does it create repeat audiences for your museum the day after the exhibition closes? After the Monets go out the door, after the Picasso leaves for Paris. So, I think that is not the answer. How then, do we find that sort of balance between the two? Okay. We always, especially policymakers, we always hate to be considered local only. I'm not sure why, and there's always this sense that the global is that larger sphere, that we are all part of this larger thing that we call the global world, and hence the museum, the local museum can't exist by itself. Its entire being must be subsumed under this global framework. It forgets one thing, that people are creative, that especially in the arts and in culture, we have more than one identity. We can be contradictory, we can be paradoxical, we can certainly be both local today and global tomorrow. What we are talking about, and what I suggest, and this is not a theoretical sort of framework I'm suggesting it as a programmatic framework for those of us that work in museums, that are actually programming, or in cultural centers, that are actually commissioning artists and putting out exhibitions and performances, is that one, we start from the fact that the local exists. Each of us, we have our local community, local artistic sort of achievements, very specific kinds of expressions. And what the global actually is, in terms of programming, is that it actually is the shared space between the various locals. What do I mean? It means that the global should be seen as a third space, as a relational space, as a way in which we carve out and identify elements in the local that can speak to other locals. So we avoid local to global. We talk about the relationship between different localities. Okay? So that sort of relational space is a shared space. It is, above all, a space we must create. As artists, as curators, as museum directors, it is not a space that's out there. It's not a space that you can point to on a map and says, if I show in London, I'm global. If I export an exhibition, of Aboriginal art to New York, I am global. It's not, It's a kind of relational position. And particularly in, I think, contemporary art and performance, it becomes easier to see. With traditional pre-modern material, it's slightly more abstract, but possible as well. Simply because what contemporary art is contemporary art is less, you know, in terms of programming, if we look at it not as a series of objects or practices, but rather as a way of communicating, of expressing certain relationships and ways of viewing the world. Contemporary art and performance becomes a kind of third language in which artists, despite the actual language that they speak at home, can find a relationship, can build a kind of bridge to artists working in the contemporary mode in another space, another history, another world. And a lot of it has to do with this idea that in art, there is the possibility to make local stories the stories of the world, the stories that pertain also to other localities, that could provoke other people and artists of other worlds to think of their own take or their own stories that relate to the story that you tell. This is Tran Thuan, the Vietnamese artist's work. These are literally furniture. You're meant to sit on them, made of various animal skins. They were commissioned for the Singapore Biennial. It's another one. And what it is a severe index finger. It's a very strange kind of story, and it refers to how during the war years, people who wanted to escape conscription would cut off the index finger so that they won't be able to, in a sense, you know, fire a rifle. But that after the war, those who had that finger missing became outcasts. You know, they became, in a sense, seen as less than patriotic to the country. So it's a very local story, but it's a story that could find parallels anywhere else in the world, not in the exact same way, certainly, but the sort of narrative behind it is there. So seemingly in our exhibitions and programs, particularly with contemporary art and performance, we need to look at common human experiences that are echoed in other places, other lives, and other cultures. And contemporary artists find ways to leap across space and time to find new connections between the work. Tracey Moffitt's video collage, the pastiche of many found videos. This is a series called Mother. Obviously, it's about the relationship between mothers and her daughters. When I acquired this work for the Singapore Art Museum, and we were thinking, you know, this is the first time we're acquiring an Australian artist for a long time, and an artist of indigenous origin, you know, what is the resonance that it could have for us with our other work? And then, of course, we found Ming Wong, who showed at the Venice Biennale his work, The Life of Imitation. Obviously, those of you who know the original film on which this is based, you know, again, you know, the sort of relationship between mother and daughter complicated by racial and cultural divides. So while they ostensibly do not have any direct connection that the artist intended, it is the role of the curator, of the director, of the exhibition maker to build those connections, to build the fact that there are common human experiences. You know, this is the global, not a place out there. The other sort of way, and we heard something about that in some of the sessions yesterday, is to look at context. And this goes straight to the heart of art historical work. We have to acknowledge that those of us that are trained in the Western art historical tradition, but yet operate, and we have to work with histories that are outside the Euro-American mainstream, that we cannot take that framework in its entirety at face value, with an innocent sort of application. and that we have to acknowledge that context sort of is a very, very powerful factor. What do we mean? Let's look at the issue of graffiti, of street art. If we imagine, for example, that street art is Banksy, the typical sort of street artist that everyone celebrates, who is unknown. He does his work without anyone knowing. You know, it is an act of resistance. So this is what you see. It's not the style. It's also these certain kinds of contextual reasons. Then when you go to a city like Yogyakarta in Indonesia and you try to understand street art there, you come into very thorny sort of situations, because the streets of Yogyakarta and of Indonesia in particular are never empty. 24 hours a day there are hawkers, licensed or unlicensed, there are street children, there are all sorts of people hanging around in the streets, you know, day and night. So this idea of a street artist secretly in the middle of the night, going there, you know, wearing the bandana and spraying and then running away, and then the next morning everybody gasps and like, who is this? You know, it doesn't exist. Instead, the process of graffiti in a place like Jogja is the artist going onto the street and asking permission from the owners of that space, all the various owners, sometimes even the policeman who is there. May I draw here? And then there is a process of discussion. The people on the streets, they have every right to tell the artist, I think you should draw me, you know. So street art, instead of becoming a personal kind of subversive gesture, is a communal product, and the artist produces it as part of this kind of process of social negotiation. But looking at the work, if you flew in the next day and you looked at the work, there's no way you can tell. There is no way you can tell it looks exactly like graffiti anywhere else in the world, minus some difference in visual idioms. So we need to be aware, you know, when we are trying to do global art projects, of the importance of this kind of contextual information that does not produce any visible, tangible marker in the artwork itself. You know, so if you were describing the artwork as a description, it becomes slightly complicated. And of course, somebody like whom we are going to present in January in New York, Hakuna Rojo, who started off as a street artist, it's even more complicated by the fact that he also works in street theater as part of the kind of social milieu of artistic activities in the sort of street environments of cities like Yogyakarta. Contemporary artists also complicate the historical, and that's the interesting, that's another way in which we can, those of us that work with very traditional materials that are very local, you know, that are very specific to particular localities and traditions, it does not mean that you cannot speak a kind of larger comparative story. And again, you know, sometimes contemporary art provides a way out, because contemporary artists, that leapfrogging that they do, you know, the tale of the Ramayana. For example, the Indonesian artist, the feminist artist Aramayani, took the last story of the Ramayana when Sita had been rescued. And in the traditional story, Sita was rescued from the demon king, but she had to go through a trial of fire. She had to walk through fire to show that she had remained pure in the time that she was a captive. And Aramayani took, sorry, I hope you can see that, took leaves actually and cut them into shadow puppets, and she created this video in which she sang, in which she played the part of Sita, and she took another perspective by having Sita saying that, why am I doing this? This is your legend. It's not my legend. Can I not want to be part of your legend? So it's a kind of, and the reason that it's made of leaves is that in the video she burns herself up. So it's a sort of ultimate kind of process. So by engaging with contemporary art, that's one way that you could find different resonances in traditional sort of material. One last note about stylistics. They really complicate things, especially with contemporary art, particularly with contemporary artists who use contemporary art itself as a subject. I always use this example as a way of talking about how difficult it is to talk about whether something is original or is derivative just because it looks like something else. And that something else is usually something from the Euro-American tradition. This is a Filipino painter, Annie Kapiting, and the artist, Michael Craig Martin, the British artist, had produced an installation called On the Shelf, where he had a crooked shelf with milk bottles in which he had filled with water, but they were inclined in such a way that the water level remained constant. So Annie Kapiting, as a painter, she painted this installation, but then she put it on a shelf, a real shelf, and the work was called On the Shelf, On the Shelf. So it's a kind of, and when I spoke to her, she said, you know, one of the things she said is, because I want to put Western conceptualism on the shelf and I never have to think about it again. Because it's her pain. Everything that she does, people will say, you know, but it doesn't look like that, doesn't it look like that? So that's just a kind of fun thing. What can we do, therefore, as museums and curators? And I'd like to suggest one practical way is to take a regional approach. The reality of history and geography is that a lot of time, over long periods of historical time, the cultures and communities that are geographically adjacent to us have much closer links to us, closer in the sense of over long periods of time, so they have there's a sense of accretion, and they provide a container through which, you know, that sense of a larger global world can be sensed and can be created. And for those of us that work with pre-modern material, you know, often historical experiences and vibrant cultural and commercial links existed before colonialism. One of the things that I always tell my curators and curators elsewhere, you know, in Asia is, there is a point in time in which you should let colonialism die. Leave it to dust. We give it too much power sometimes. You know, there are times when we, by continuing to talk about it, we give it more power in shaping, in determining, in explaining who we are today. You know, so there may be occasions in which we want to step back and say, let's not talk about the colonial. Let's leave it to silence for once. But instead, you know, one very easy way, not easy, sorry, practical way is, of course, to look at the pre-colonial and the post-colonial. And for ethnographical museums and museums of antiquity, the pre-colonial history of the region around us, wherever we may be, I think are prime staging posts in which this kind of global story can be recaptured. This is, in Singapore, exists a very important, possibly the most important shipwreck that's been found in recent years, the Belitung shipwreck, which was a 9th century shipwreck that was found on Belitung Island. It's a Tang Dynasty shipwreck. Okay. And what was interesting about this shipwreck was that it proved once and for all, because it was on an Arab dhow that was only about 50 meters in length. Within it, there were 60,000 pieces of ceramics. They were stacked like this. And what was interesting, it proved indisputably that not just that trade between the Arab, Iranian, Persian world existed with East Asia, but it proved once and for all the scale of industrial production, because most of the wares found, most of these 60,000 pieces found were export ware. So they were produced for an export, for a global sort of market. They weren't produced for industrial production. The Chinese ware were also traced to different kilns all over China, which means there had to be, guess what, a distribution and collecting network that funneled produce to the port, and then it would shipped out. And several kind of firsts, like it demonstrated that blue and white porcelain was much earlier than we had imagined. This is about 830 AD. And of course, the interesting thing was that the trade was not state-led. This trade was completely private enterprise. Okay. It also had rather unusual things, like the tang, gold and silver that was found was of a style that was not associated with export ware. Rather, they seemed to be much more similar to gold and silver that was produced within the courts, you know, for internal consumption, so to speak. So even with traditional material, you can build a kind of story of the region, the kind of story of different localities, you know, and the relationships between them way before the coming of the colonialists. There are definitely waves of globalization before the Europeans came. And then finally, for those of you interested in policy, I just wanted to say a little bit about the Singapore Art Museum, about my experiences of working in a very, very small kind of museum with a very, very specific mission, and how to build, in a sense, a kind of larger voice for the museum. The museum, of course, before the opening of the National Gallery late last year, was the only visual art institution, and it focused on the work of late 19th to 21st century art, particularly of Southeast Asia. When I arrived at the museum, it was with the full awareness that the National Gallery would take over all the modern art collections. So I was asked to build a contemporary art collection. I had 3 years to do it. I don't advise you to do it in 3 years, if you can. And to change the museum into a museum of contemporary art. So the collection building was rather aggressive, to focus on contemporary Southeast Asian as well as the sort of Asian collection. Okay, sorry. Okay. What would be interesting, I think, for those of us working in museums is, of course, how we dealt with the challenges of being a latecomer. We are very, very late. There's no way we can be a museum of Impressionism. There's no way we can be a museum of abstract expressionism. It will always be patchy, even if one were to have the money. So we started with the fact that we had no inherited collections of great depth. And the fact that with contemporary art, the globality of art production constrains the ability to collect diversity of art production in any depth. As a small museum, we also did not want a collection whose size far, exceeded our ability to show them. We didn't want a museum where 99% of the work is in storage. Of course, we also had this issue of how do we start building curatorial knowledge. The other thing which those of us, especially in Asia and the Asia Pacific, have to worry about, I suppose, is the expansion of the Euro-American Museum initiatives into Asia. We were very wary of being just a receiver of blockbuster shows, the sort of touring syndrome that had been spoken about, but also being a kind of host for an outpost of a Western sort of brand name. Then, of course, this issue of ultimately relevance. What do we do that is relevant to the world? And my response was even more aggressively to look at an emerging region around us, to look at Southeast Asia, the countries of ASEAN, and the larger regions around that, China, India specifically, and a little bit of Australia, New Zealand. Strangely enough, we have one Mongolian work and one Mexican work. You can ask me why I have one Mexican later, but all museums have these kinds of things. Okay, so what we did was to adopt a regional focus, to look at a Southeast Asian and Asian focused direct collection. And what we aggressively went about was to, I split the curators up into country focus rather than medium. And the reason is because of language and culture. Because I needed the curators to become familiar, to have working familiarity with the particular communities and artistic cultures of particular countries, and to have some sort of exposure to basic linguistic ability. So rather than have a curator of painting, a curator of photography, basically I made the curators, you look after Malaysia, you look after Indonesia, you look after particular countries. And the idea was that they would build locality-specific knowledge. What I did was I made it such that, well, basically I told the curators, I don't want to see you in the office for 3 months a year. I wanted to see them roughing it out in the field. And the brief was that they should almost be like anthropologists. Okay. And out of that, what we did was we started to produce a lot of regionally inflected programming. We had the signature art prize, the triennial art prize. We made regional surveys. We made regional artist surveys. So we did also, solos of artists from around the region. And of course, ultimately ending in the Singapore Biennale for 2013, which I'll talk a little bit about. But really the point is that we would become experts in a very specific region that no one else had. And the idea was that anyone else coming from New York, Paris, London, Beijing, Sydney, and you wanted to know about any of the artists from the region, you would come to Singapore, you would come to the Singapore Art Museum. You want to know what the art objects are like, you will come and look at our collections. So at the same time, we collected, at the end of 3 years, 400 objects from the region, all of which are published, fully published in the catalogue as a kind of reference work. Okay. And now we go to the Biennale. When I was asked to take over the Singapore Biennale initially in 2011, but later much more in 2013, I gave the owners of the Biennale, the council, the National Arts Council, one condition, that it would be regionally focused, one. And two, the very controversial thing which a lot of curators hated me for it to this day, was I said there would be no artistic director. And the reason I said that was I wanted a Biennale that did not have an Uber curator. And I did not want a nomadic curator who would fly in and fly out on field trips, visit artists that would be introduced by intermediaries, and then, they will plot them in like that. And I wanted a Biennale that really reflected the diversity of artistic production. A Biennale not of interpretation, but a Biennale that mapped the region. And this was part of a kind of endpoint of a strategy to paint the museum, to position the museum as a kind of convening point for the region, for anyone who wanted to know about the region. So, the Biennale was about articulating local differences, mapping an emerging region of artistic production. It was suggesting the possibility of developing a distinct identity, and ultimately it was hoped that it would present a basis for comparative presentation with artists from other regions. So we talk about who we are first before we are able to talk about who others are. And what I did was I had 27 co-curators. And what they were actually is we went around the countries of ASEAN and we looked for local curators, indigenous curators who had been working in that scene for at least a decade. And what we had was that we had 10 years of curatorial experience each, from each of the 27 curators. You know, something that a nomadic curator would never be able to achieve. And so we came up with rather interesting sort of artists, people like Tony Kanwa from Bandung, but also I think he's also in Brussels, this commission, and he makes, for all intents and purposes, carving, wood carving in the indigenous way. But the interesting thing is that's a centimeter high. Each of these sculptures, they are like that. And he does it by hand, without any machinery. So there was a big installation. So a different kind of aesthetic. Sway Sareth was gone on to very big sort of things. His sort of stuffed toy, camouflage covered sculpture of the churning of the sea of milk. Sheiko from Malaysia, and this is a waiting room. Can anyone guess what's a waiting room for? It's a waiting room for people going to be interviewed for transgender operation. And Sheiko Reto is a transgender artist, and she actually is a very interesting character. She's from Kuala Lumpur, and she actually is commissioned by the Ministry of the Health Department to actually illustrate in vernacular language and pictures, you know, the sort of manuals and guidebooks and information pamphlets for people who are inquiring about sex change procedures. So she recreated, you know, in her kind of visual language, this waiting room. And this is Ahmad Abu Bakar, Malaysian-born artist who now resides in Singapore. A work called Teluk Belanga, and what he has been working with the prisons for very long, with the prisoners, with the Art in Prisons program for very long. And what he did was he made this boat, he had this boat made in the traditional kind of style, and there are bottles, of course, message in the bottles, and each bottle is inscribed, there's a number, is inscribed and attributed to a particular prisoner. And the prisoner wrote a sort of message as to what he would do, he or she would do, if they were free, if the world changed, as the title of the Biennale goes. And it was placed in the foyer of the museum, and the public actually were encouraged to pick any of the messages in the bottle and write a message back to the inmate, put it back in the bottle, and because the bottles are inscribed, it could be identified, and we could give it back to the respective inmate. So it was a way for the artists to help them break their isolation. A kind of, he spoke of how strangers could still be friends, you know, through this kind of artistic product, and some of the messages are truly quite personal. So this is the Biennale, and what happened with the Biennale was that of all the artists that we showed, over 95% of them had never been shown in another international Biennale. And we did this also because when we actually did some research, we actually got a lot of interns to compile artists in international biennales, and usually 3/4 of artists that have appeared in one, whether it's in Guangzhou or Venice or Sao Paulo, they have appeared in another biennale. So it's a kind of very closed circuit, which unfortunately one of the results of that, it excludes a lot of art, particularly from the other regions. Finally, I just want to end with, so that's one way to do it as a museum. At Asia Society, just leave with one note of what we're doing at Asia Society. The way I'm conceiving the programming is that Asia Society is a convener, first and foremost, a place in which many cultures meet, in which we try to encourage empathy towards the cultures of others. And the motivation for that is, of course, the fact that we are living in a world where people, events are conspiring to paint the world in black and white, to polarize the world. And the role of a place like Asia Society, just like any other museum and cultural institution, is to resist that polarization, is to insist that shades of grey need to exist, that people are ambiguous, people are complex and sophisticated, you know, it can't be painted into the corner. And that, in a sense, it's how we see the arts there. So, and it's, again, you know, when this is our 60th anniversary, when I went to dig in our archives, it wasn't something that new. In the fall of 1975, musicians and dancers from the Burmese National Theatre became the first performing artist troupe from then Burma to be presented in the US. And they actually, you know, came to Asia Society, and at the same time, you know, they met the dancers from Martha Graham, and having a workshop with the Martha Graham Company in 1975. How cool is that? And so our programming, our exhibition programming, is going to move towards this idea of exploring the encounter across worlds, this idea of artists as nomads who move between worlds, and in their moving, they sort of encourage and facilitate the interface and the coming together of different realms of experience. In the fall of this year, we are going to show the first solo survey of the Chinese modern Zhaoji in the US since 1968. But our show, rather than being a pure retrospective, we don't start at the beginning and say later you go on, and then this the end, and then he dies. But instead, we start from the encounter. We start from the point at which he, as an artist from China in the first half of the 20th century, you know, after the communist takeover, he turns up in Paris, and suddenly, you know, this is a man that, even though he's Chinese, he's trained in oil painting, Western oil painting. He's not trained in ink painting. But only when he turns up in Paris, and then he had a famous quote, which for some reason I've lost, so I can't give you, but he had a famous quote when he says, "It was only when I went to Paris that I discovered I was a Chinese painter." And the first encounter with the West, you know, produced works like Pavilion Rouge, in which he was actually abstracting words from oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty, as well as bronze from the Zhou, into works like this, which later became more and more abstracted into the sort of now currently $1 million works that we are more familiar with. And this is an artist that is claimed by both the Chinese modern art tradition as well as French lyrical abstraction. Zhao Wuji is the artist of the French presidents, in case you didn't know. So the encounter as a way of looking, of dealing with both what it means to be local as well as, you know, what it means to be global, and how to reconcile that. And probably in all realms of human endeavor, it is in the arts that the tension and the sort of relationship between local specificity and global means can be sort of presented in a much more meaningful way. So I just want to leave all of your, you know, curators and museum people with this, that do not, in a sense, be afraid. Do not be afraid of local specificity. Do not be afraid of the region around you. You know, they are your best kind of links to this wonderful world that we call the global, that we all aspire to. But at the same time, you know, look to the region as a kind of frame, as a kind of staging post to begin to look at how we can create the world by creating, by finding, by discovering the things that tie us. And look to the artists who are border crossers, who are world builders, who cross from one realm to another in their practice. For they are the ones that will, in a sense, lead the way for us as institutions, you know, again, outside the sort of Euro-American sphere ahead. Thank you.